know that feeling? Some stories don't just begin with flashing police lights or a dramatic 911 call. Sometimes they begin with something much calm. A child simply isn't seen anymore, or in the compound, during the busy time, nobody really notices, because everyone assumes someone else knows where that child is. Days pass, then weeks, then months, everything changes. Eventually years go by, and before anyone fully realizes what's happened, that little girl has disappeared from everyone's world. Just imagine that feeling that will go through the mind of everyone. That's exactly what makes Harmony Montgomery's story so heartbreaking. This isn't just another true crime case, or sometimes another. It's the story of a little fine girl who slowly faded from public view, while the adults who were supposed to protect her failed her in one way or another. By the time investigators finally understood the full picture, they weren't searching for a missing child anymore. They were trying to solve what they believed had become a murder. What a painful feelings. The story brings us to New Hampshire. On the surface, it's the kind of place where life seems quiet and ordinary. Families go to work during quiet time. Children ride their bikes, play with friends, neighbors wave at each other with a kind smile, and nothing looks out of place. But as we've seen in so many investigations, terrible things don't always happen in places that look dangerous. Sometimes they happen behind the front door of an ordinary home, where nobody else can see what's going on. Harmony's life wasn't just easy from the very beginning. Harmony was born into a family that struggled with serious problems. There were issues involving addiction, unstable relationships, and constant uncertainty. Instead of growing up in one safe and predictable home, Harmony spent part of her early childhood moving through the child welfare system before eventually being placed in the custody of her father. Just imagine passing through that act. Adam Montgomery. Looking back now, that's one of the hardest parts of this entire story. At the time, the court believed it was making the right decision based on the information available. Nobody could see the future. Nobody knew how everything would eventually unfold. But when you know the ending, it's impossible not to wonder if things could have turned out differently. By the end of 2019, Harmony was living with her father, his wife Kayla, and several other children. Life inside that household was anything but stable. Money was always tight. The family moved from place to place. They struggled to keep a roof over their heads, and according to testimony that was presented in court, drug addiction had become a major part of everyday life. Then something strange began to happen. Harmony didn't just suddenly vanish in the way we usually imagine missing person cases. There wasn't a desperate emergency call. There wasn't a statewide search the next morning. Instead, she slowly disappeared from everyone's sight, and some people was asking, "Where is Harmony?" She stopped going to school. Nobody saw her at doctor's appointments anymore. Family members gradually lost contact with her. It happened so quietly that for far too long, nobody outside that immediate household realized that a little girl had completely disappeared. And honestly, that's one of the most disturbing parts of this entire case. According to prosecutors, investigators believe Harmony was killed sometime around December of 2019. But to prove exactly what happened wasn't easy. By the time police began seriously investigating her disappearance, years had already passed. Think about that for a moment. Imagine trying to solve something that happened years earlier. Security cameras are long gone. People have moved away. Memories have faded. Places have changed. Any physical evidence that might have existed has either disappeared or been destroyed by time itself. So detectives had to do something incredibly difficult. Instead of relying on one single piece of evidence, they had to rebuild Harmony's final days, almost like putting together a giant puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. Every interview mattered. Every text message mattered. Every rental record, every financial transaction, every small detail that seemed meaningless on its own, suddenly became incredibly important when placed beside everything else. One person who would eventually become central to the investigation was Kayla Montgomery. Her testimony painted a picture of a home filled with fear, instability, and violence. She described Harmony allegedly being physically abused by Adam Montgomery on multiple occasions. Prosecutors argued that those incidents eventually led to the little girl's death. The defense, however, challenged parts of Kayla's testimony. They pointed out inconsistencies in some of her statements, arguing that memories can change over time, especially after traumatic experiences. And to be fair, that's something juries often have to consider. Human memory isn't perfect. People remember events differently. That's why investigators never rely on just one witness alone. Instead, they compare every statement against everything else they know. According to the prosecution's timeline, Harmony suffered fatal injuries after being assaulted while inside the family vehicle. Witness testimony suggested she became less and less responsive until she eventually died. But here's what made this investigation incredibly unusual. Harmony's body has never been found. That changed everything. Normally, homicide investigators depend heavily on forensic evidence from the victim. Medical examiners determine exactly how someone died. Crime scene analysts examine physical evidence. DNA tells part of the story. None of that was possible here. Without Harmony's body, investigators had to prove two things at the same time. First, that she was no longer alive, and second, that her death was the result of murder. That's an enormous challenge. According to testimony presented during the trial, prosecutors argued that after Harmony died, extraordinary efforts were made to hide what had happened. Witnesses described her body allegedly being moved from place to place, while the family continued changing locations. Those accounts became some of the most emotional moments inside the courtroom. If they're accurate, they help explain why investigators spent years searching without finding the one thing every family desperately hopes for: a chance to finally bring their loved one home. Experienced homicide detectives often say that when there isn't one piece of overwhelming evidence, the truth has to be built brick by brick. That's exactly what happened here. Investigators searched multiple homes connected to the family. They examined electronic devices. They interviewed witnesses again and again. Sometimes a person remembered one tiny detail they hadn't thought was important before. Another witness would unknowingly confirm part of that memory. Then documents would support both accounts. Little by little, the timeline became clearer. But throughout the entire investigation, one question refused to go away. How could a little girl disappear for so long without anyone realizing she was truly missing? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't one single mistake. Instead, it appears to have been a series of failures across different systems. Schools had pieces of information. Child welfare agencies had other pieces. Family members knew certain things. Medical providers had their own records. Nobody seemed to have the entire picture at the same time. And while everyone held a few pieces of the puzzle, Harmony kept slipping further and further into the background until years had passed. By the time authorities fully understood what they were dealing with, they weren't looking for a runaway child anymore. They were investigating what prosecutors believed was murder. When the case finally reached trial, the courtroom became a place where ordinary moments from years earlier suddenly carried enormous weight. Conversations that once seemed forgettable were examined word by word. Old receipts, housing records, phone activity, and witness testimony were carefully connected, one piece after another. The defense reminded jurors of something important. Harmony's body had never been found. Without physical remains or a medical examination, they argued there was still room for reasonable doubt. Prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that while one crucial piece of evidence was missing, the mountain of surrounding evidence pointed in only one direction. They believed the combined witness testimony, timelines, behavior, and supporting records told the story that Harmony herself no longer could. Outside the courtroom, people across New Hampshire were asking difficult questions of their own. How did this happen? Could someone have stepped in sooner? Could this little girl's life have been saved if the warning signs had been connected earlier? Those are painful questions because there are no easy answers. Even after years of investigation, countless interviews, and a lengthy trial, one heartbreaking reality remained exactly the same. Harmony still hadn't been found. For everyone who worked on the case. For the investigators, prosecutors, and especially for those who loved her, that absence never stopped hurting. Because no matter what happened inside the courtroom, there was still one hope that remained unfulfilled: to bring Harmony home.